Well, I think there's both chaos and confusion, both within the US government's aid architecture, however that looks moving forward, and on the ground in emergencies. As we've heard, Rubio seems intent to merge USAID with the State Department. That has massive implications. Obviously, the intent seems to be to make aid smaller. Already, you've heard about the aid freezes and the suspended programs. The problem is that waiver that was mentioned is really hard to interpret. We're talking about, life-saving aid, but what does that mean in practice? I think the U.S. is the top donor of humanitarian aid. Humanitarian aid, it talks about conflicts, disasters, crises. They contribute up to 30 to 40% of the yearly humanitarian aid budgets. So, the implications are that emergencies are skyrocketing around the world because aid leaders don't have solutions to end conflicts or to cooperate to end conflicts. So I think humanitarian aid system has grown along with it. So the implications are emergency aid will need to get smaller, but will there be a corresponding increase in efforts to address these emergencies if there's not money there?
As in our countries, which are big recipients of US aid at the moment, Ukraine, Ethiopia, Afghanistan, Yemen, even in more recent times, the conflict in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Are these countries watching what is happening and having to now actually work out bigger solutions to the problems that they have?
I think there are multiple different perspectives from the grounded countries that receive aid. First of all, humanitarian aid is, as I said, it tends to focus on a very small portion of what people typically think is foreign aid, which is, money for disasters, emergency response, food, water, emergency healthcare. So certainly for people in crises, for example, I've spoken with community aid leaders in Myanmar. They're telling me that mobile health clinics are shut down. They're feeling really betrayed, hurt. In Somalia, I've spoken with aid leaders who are a bit more cautious, but they're very worried about recently failed rains and another rainy season coming up that doesn't look very promising. For governments, on the other hand, it's a different calculation. I think Trump is clearly transactional. He's very let's make a deal. And governments know this. I think we've seen with Trump's approach to tariffs recently among his allies and neighbors in North America, he's clearly transactional. And I think countries that on the receiving end of aid, whether it's directly or through organized emergency response, will have to get used to this sort of transactionality. I think governments have always viewed humanitarian aid as soft power, which makes humanitarians uncomfortable and aid more difficult in conflict. And for Trump, I think it's clear that aid is much more than a political tool. It's more of a bludgeon.
Yes, you talked about transactional, exchanges in this case, and I think in the case of Ukraine, he was talking about rare earths in exchange for aid. In the Asia Pacific, you're talking about countries in the Pacific, in Vietnam, for instance, that may not have a lot to give. And we've got Pacific Island leaders saying that they're going to try and persuade Donald Trump to change his stance by raising concerns. Do you think they might be able to achieve that in personal conversations with Donald Trump?
It's hard to say. As I say, Trump is clearly transactional. So I think he's relationship dependent and he's in tune to his domestic audience. But there's not a lot of pushback domestically right now. So I think it depends on how countries work together. Certainly, I think in the Pacific Islands, there's much more of a history of working together as a community than there are, for example, in other jurisdictions. But they don't necessarily have a lot to bargain with. And when it comes to humanitarian aid, I think most humanitarians would agree it's not something that should be a bargaining chip. It's literally life and death in many cases. So I think the ripple effects will be profound for many around the world, and I think there will be questions around what other donor governments might do. Australia, for example, will they move to fill the gap? The government clearly doesn't have enough money to cover what the U.S. covers, or perhaps more likely, will Trump's policies enable other governments to also cut back? And I think that's also something to look out for as Australia heads to elections.
Yes, of course. And in the case of Australia and other countries, maybe even China, which has its own aid program, to expect countries to fill the gap, is that unrealistic given that so many countries around the world are are being pressurized by domestic issues, especially the cost of living?
I think it's unrealistic in the sense that, well, I'll start over on that. Money-wise, it's realistic. There is enough money in this world. Humanitarian aid is a tiny percentage of foreign aid, which is a tiny percentage of the budget of the United States, for example, and in every country in the world. However, it's about political will. In terms of stepping in to fill the gap on a short to medium term basis, I don't see that happening because every country has their own priorities. But also, the humanitarian aid sector has not made itself particularly enticing, I suppose, to other countries. There's long been a push to diversify funding. We wouldn't be in this position if the humanitarian sector did not depend on one country for 30 to 40% of its budget. But here we are. And it hasn't really been able to convince other countries, China, BRICS bloc, Gulf states, to come on board. And I think that's because it's seen as a system that's essentially run by quote unquote Western governments. And if you look at who the big donors are, it's hard to argue with that. So until the system itself is able to reform and to make itself feel like it's part of the global community and an investment for the global community and not a few countries, then I think very little will change in the short term.
Okay, Irwin Loy, I really appreciate your thoughts on this. Thank you so much.
Thank you.